So last night I had an argument with a young lady, it was online, who may or may not have been a feminist, but she was using feminist talking points or arguments that feminists put out. Anyway, she made several remarks concerning domestic violence being largely a female problem. It mostly affects women. And men mostly being the perpetrators. Now, I actually pushed back against this and on the grounds that I don't think it is a gendered issue. And I suggested to her that it's better to just look at it being a problem of domestic abuse as opposed to domestic violence. And she didn't like that. She just kept pushing back and insisting, no, women are the main victims and men are the main perpetrators, and men need to kind of step up and we need to protect the women. And yes, as you know, a lot of people know these days that is a particular framing of the situation that feminists like to put out there. But I objected to this, and I stood my ground, and I pushed back, and because I don't like the fact that we even call it domestic violence. I use the term domestic abuse. And the reason is that abuse is a broader term. It encompasses violence, but it also includes verbal abuse and psychological abuse, which is, I would argue, just as serious as physical violence. And a lot of people kind of go, oh yeah, but surely physical violence is worse than that verbal psychological abuse. And I actually disagree, because there are lots of cases of people committing suicide, and the end result of like a really violent relationship would be murder, and that would be the worst case scenario to take place. But the end result of psychological abuse is also both suicide, which could, in some cases, it's almost considered murder, and there are a lot of famous cases where they've had like a woman or a girlfriend goading their partner into killing themselves and helping them to kill themselves, or set up conditions in their life that are so horrendous, like they can't access their children and they're framed as being the guilty one and the one caused all the problems, even though she is a big part of the problem, and feeling so helpless that they commit suicide. And so if the end result is the same as violence, physical violence, that people getting killed, then I'm going to make the case that they should be taken equally seriously. And yes, I know some people are going to disagree, but just because physical violence is an obvious thing to see doesn't mean that psychological violence is less important and shouldn't be taken into account. Now, the other objection I had was this framing as women as the primary victims is distracting. It's making the focus on the sex of the people involved and not on the abuse. And I think the abuse is where we should be focused, where we should be trying to understand and educate people to see the dangers of abuse, whether physical or psychological, and that any programs directed to stopping domestic abuse should be targeted to as education in that regards, and not to poor women, men bad, which is not helping the situation. Because I didn't agree with her, I started getting accused of, being somehow for, battering wives and stuff like that, and that's ridiculous. That's nuts. Of course, nobody is for that. Like, maybe some extreme tiny fringe population that you can take and pretend that that's most men, but the reality is the vast majority of men and the vast majority of women all agree that abuse, whether violent or psychological, is not good and not on. So I get really annoyed with this whole framing of like, you don't agree with me perfectly, therefore you must be this horrible rape apologist or something like that. Absolute bunk. So now she kept pushing, and she put up these like infographics, and so I've got a few of the infographics here, and I'll just put them up on the screen and I'll go through them for you. And so she's put up this one here, like, one woman is killed every 9 days, and one man is killed every 29 days by a partner. And you go, at first sight, you kind of go, well, that's really bad. That's really awful. Women are getting killed at least 3 times more often than men. Now, in intimate partner violence. But one of the problems with these statistics is that they don't include things like when the wife or girlfriend hires a hitman or has a jealous boyfriend who then kills the husband. And if you look at the murder statistics, you'll see that twice as many men are murdered than women. And a lot of the men are murdered by other men who are sleeping with their wives or girlfriends. And so if you were to factor those men into the count as domestic violence, and they're not in the statistic, you're going to find that men and women are murdered by their partner at roughly equal rates. I do listen to like true crime podcasts, and it does come up quite often that men are murdered by their spouses, but not by the woman directly. She usually pays or manipulates another man into killing her partner. And so, yeah, I immediately go, I don't really trust that statistic. Anyway, the next one is 25,000 sexual assaults recorded by police in 2017. This is problematic because I've seen other ones say that was 75,000, others say 100,000, some 50,000. It's these stats are not that reliable, and there's a lot of variation from like state to state. And it's like, part of the problem is what is a sexual assault, and how they actually record them statistically, because there may have been a report, but was that actually true? Was it ever verified? And these kind of stats are not terribly reliable. And the other thing is we call them sexual assaults. So if we just simply called them assault and we took out the sex element, there's a huge number of men being assaulted by other men. Huge. That dwarfs this. And so again, it's like, well, why are you putting this statistic here? And again, it's like, well, you're trying to put a certain frame on the situation that poor women, because it's sexual assault, poor women are being battered by men, when men are overwhelmingly the primary victims of violent crime. And then, here we've got the next one. So 1 in 6 women and 1 in 16 men. So you've got the women, it's in bold, it's big, and they've actually got an outline because they're people and the men aren't. And 1 in 16 men in Australia have experienced physical or sexual violence from a current or previous cohabiting partner. Now, one of the things about this is it doesn't tell you how many of these couples are homosexual, how many are lesbian or polyamorous or something else. I mean, so you can't really tell the breakdown, and lesbian couples are known to have the most incidences of domestic violence. So again, it's not very clear. But the other thing is that we're talking about physical violence, and that tends to be something that men are more likely to do. Whereas the psychological violence, there's no such thing as psychological violence. Psychological abuse is much more likely for women. And women know this. Women know that the worst bullies, manipulators, and in terms of psychological bullying are other women. So again, it's like, well, they've selected it in a way. They know that men are most likely to commit domestic abuse in a violent way, so that's how you can kind of get this framing going on. At the same time, ignoring the psychological abuse, which I just argued is potentially just as harmful as the physical abuse. And yeah, here we are. I've got 25% of women and 5% of men have experienced emotional abuse from a current or previous cohabiting partner. And again, we've got a definition problem here, because what does emotional abuse mean? And this is a thing where if men have an argument, they often raise their voices, but no man is ever going to say, "You raised my voice, that's intimidating." But women are more likely to do that, and it creates a problem. I mean, is it abuse? And I think in some cases it could be, but I mean, men are very unlikely to report it that way, and women are much more likely to report it, and that's a bias that comes into these kind of statistics. And I know I kind of just finished this by saying, like, I just think logically, the sex ratio of domestic abuse is probably roughly 50-50%. And I think that for a very straightforward, logical reason, which I hope you'll follow, is that people who commit domestic abuse grew up in abusive households where there's abusive abuse going on in the household, and that normalizes it. They're used to that, they've seen that, and they see that as being normal most of the time. Now, roughly about 1 in 4 of those kids break out of that, and they heal and they stop the cycle of abuse, but about 3/4 keep going on with the abuse. And because there's a 50-50 split of sexes, and so the children growing up in this environment of abusive household are going to be 50-50. Logically speaking, unless there is some aspect where one sex is more likely to turn around and break the cycle more than the other, and I don't know if there's any evidence of that the case, but assuming all things are equal, then logically you're going to have a 50-50 split of children growing into adults who think that abuse is normal and acceptable. That's just what you're going to have logically. So that is the reason why I'm pretty sure the split of abusers is going to be in the 50-50 range between male and female. Anyway, so you might be asking, well, if that's the case, how can I explain those statistics there? I mean, I went a little bit over there, but some of the other things to consider when reading these statistics is, well, first one, who are the people who collected these statistics? Was it a third party of researchers who were hired and they've got no bias going into as little as possible into the project? Or were they actually feminist researchers collecting it with questions or leading questions that lead to particular answers? And was it a random sample, or were they after women who were in battered women's shelters and stuff like that, which wouldn't be a random sample at all? Or hospital admissions, again, will not be a random sample. So these questions need to be asked. And whenever you see these statistics, you can't just assume that the person making these statistics has actually gone and done their due diligence and done it properly. It is always a case that if you want to lay an argument or make a decision based on statistics, that you go back to the source of it and read through it. And when I see these government statistics which don't even tell me which paper or how they collected them or reached their methodology, I just simply go, I don't care, it's rubbish. I mean, if I don't know how the data was collected and they're not going to tell me and give me the information to find out, I shouldn't be taking them seriously. I mean, I could be falling for a massive manipulation if I just took them on face value, and that's why you never take an authority that claims to be an authority. You always see your authorities being the truth, and if you can't verify that it's the truth from reason or evidence, then you really can't trust it. So the other issue is like, how do you define domestic violence? And this is a very tricky thing when you're collecting these kind of statistics, because as said, that men and women tend to see violence differently. Like, men might even shove each other, and they may not call that violence. But if a man shoves a woman, well, that's quite likely to be violence. And this will have an impact on the results. And so this is why I think we see this skewing. And I'm not saying that when men shove each other, it's not necessarily violence and that's not necessarily an issue in abuse, but I'm just saying that those men are very likely not to record that. And so they're going to be underrepresented in these statistics in any case. And the other thing is that verbal abuse, if you're not even looking for this, well, you're not even going to see it. Because men, a lot of the time, verbal abuse is just banter, or it's cussing can be a bonding thing within a group of men where they call each other insults. And this is a very common thing where men say mean things to each other, but they don't mean it. Whereas women say nice things to each other, and they don't mean it either. And that's that's basically where a lot of this is, where the men don't tend to be psychologically abusive like women are much more likely to be. And yeah, again, I really do think the stats, when you control for it and look for domestic abuse, you are going to find a 50-50 ratio of men and women. But yeah, these statistics are quite dubious. So the other thing is, what's wrong with having a gendered framing of domestic abuse? Well, it leads to laws and government policies that treat women as the victims and men as perpetrators. And you'll have all the sorts of government programs where it's like, well, we've got all this support for women who are victims, but the men, well, they have to go to anger management programs, and they're treated like they're a criminal even if they are the victims, like it's very often a case where men have been victimized by women. The law has been weaponized against them with a very low standard of evidence required to just start legal proceedings against a man, and he has to defend himself. Then it's weaponizing the legal system to be used as a tool of harassment. And those men will definitely never be included as the people suffering from domestic abuse. And this is a result of gendering the issue. If we're going to look at men and women as being victims and perpetrators in that way, instead of just looking at people and not looking at their sexes, we just say, well, we have support for victims, whoever they are, and we'll have help for like anger management or whatever, alcohol addiction counseling and stuff like that for whoever they are. It doesn't need to be gendered. That's the thing. You don't need to assume gender. And the fact that this gets into government just tells you just how much influence feminists have on government. When it doesn't make any sense to do it this way. It's a very discriminatory system that they've introduced, which is just not how policy should be. Anyway, so the other thing is that it's kind of creating a perverse financial incentive where you've got all this funding for women and tempting them to divorce. Now, of course, if they're in a really violent, messed up, abusive relationship, well, that's good. They should be leaving. But if you've got women who aren't in an abusive relationship, but they're like, oh, wow, I can get access to all these support services to help me and help me get the kids and help me get more of the settlement than him, and I can actually kick him out of my life and he's gone and so on, then you're creating a perverse incentive for taxpayer money to be used to, again, perpetuate abuse. And so it's not a good idea to have these kind of gendered solutions in policy. And I really think if I'm not going to just be talking about the problems of the current system, but I'll give you some advice that we should be focusing on education on what is abuse, and more generally, not just domestic abuse, but what is abusive behavior. Because I find with my work, when I'm working with clients, a lot of them don't actually know that they've been abused, particularly psychologically abused. They don't even realize it. And while I'm talking to them, I'm listening to them, and I give them some feedback, and I'll say things like, wow, that seems really rough, what happened there, and that she said that to you. And there's this kind of realization in their heads like, oh, she was being mean to me, and I hadn't kind of realized that she's actually kind of manipulating and controlling me. And that there's this big realization that, oh yes, I've often been bullied and abused by people my whole life in my family, and I didn't realize it. I couldn't see it because I grew up in that environment. I normalized it, and I didn't see what was in front of me. And so never underestimate the value of having an education program that helps people to spot what is abuse. And maybe I should do a video, just what is abuse. It's a bit much here. But the other thing, and this is a very personal topic for me, is that I grew up in a very broken home. So my father wasn't physically violent, but he was an alcoholic, and both my parents were quite psychologically abusive, very abusive, and I grew up in a household with lots of shouting, lots of conflict, and lots of name calling and mind games. And it got to its worst point when I was 12. And my parents had just been shouting at each other and blah, blah, blah. It was really horrific. My father was like hitting walls and stuff, and it was hell. And I won't go into all the details of what happened, but it was a terrifying situation for me as a 12-year-old to go through. And I just learned to sleep with a cricket bat or some other weapon next to my bed. That was just normal to me. And I was a victim of domestic abuse. But neither of my parents, my father was abusive, my mother was abusive, and neither of them got me help. I never got that help. Like, I have had to go through years of therapy and thousands of dollars in counseling and talking about this because of what happened to me, and deprogramming myself to see the abuse and stop the internalization and normalization of the abuse. But I'm invisible. I'm not on those statistics. And this is the problem. A lot of children are. Because for a lot of children, both parents are abusive. They both normalize it, so they don't see there's a problem, because no one points out this is abusive, this can't go on, and your children are suffering. And the parents are very often too embarrassed to even admit what they're doing. And the children are where the focus should be. It should not be men and women, or men versus women. It should be very much focused on improving childhood. How can we make childhood better and safer for children? Because that is the key to breaking the cycle of abuse, stopping this from being normalized and passed on from generation to generation. And so that is where the focus should be. And I get very frustrated when people try to derail it and say, oh, men are the perpetrators and women are the victims. It's just a distraction. It's a total distraction from the real problem, and it keeps us from getting to the real solution, and that's helping children, making sure that family is a safe and a nurturing environment for them, so that the cycle is broken and abuse hopefully disappears from society altogether. I think that's a good goal to aim for. But none of these policies with the gendered-focused ones seem to even scratch the surface. They don't seem to actually change it, because the cycle keeps going, and if anything, it's getting worse. There's more families falling apart, more divorces, more abuse going on, and more children being thrown under the bus. Anyway, I hope this has broadened your mind on this topic. And please, if you found this interesting, please share, like, subscribe to other people, get the word out, get more people thinking about these issues in a broader sense, and not just be focused on the same talking points that they are constantly being brought up in the media and by feminists over and over again. Try to look at things from a different perspective to see that there is actually the problems. Solving problems is very much a case of being able to correctly identify what the problem is, and a lot of people don't want you to identify the problem because they've got their own issues. And feminists often have their own issues, and they're just pushing their own agenda, and it's not helpful for most people. So, until next time, per aspera ad astra.